I've heard you mention both collective intergenerational trauma and ancestral intergenerational trauma. And I'm wondering to you, what's the difference between those two?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with so individual trauma. We all know, like if something happened during our lifetime, like something in our childhood or later on, a traumatizing event. So there is a kind of a biographical frame or narrative that surrounds the traumatization. Sometimes it's coherent, sometimes it's less coherent, and then within that individual traumatization, we see that actually attachment trauma, that for because some people might say, oh, I haven't experienced a war and I didn't experience a car accident, so I'm not traumatized. But then when we look deeper in a very fragile childhood process of attachment and growing into our bodies, into our emotional experience, into relation with the world, that many things can be very overwhelming for us children, either being neglected or overwhelmed. So then we found out, wow, there is actually a much more hidden traumatization that is not just massive abuse, that also creates trauma structures. And then when we look deeper, then we see, wow, the way our ancestors have been traumatized affected our parents, and that affected our attachment process, and that affects the course of our lives. So the ancestral traumatization is being passed on, of course, through the education and through the psychological environment, the family system. But as we work together also with epigenetic scientists, we see, wow, epigenetics transmit certain epigenetic markers for higher stress level, higher anxiety levels, and so on. So there is literally a physical transmission, and there is a social and psychological transmission of ancestral trauma from one generation to the next. And then I found out, wow, when I was working with large groups, and especially after the Second World War and the Second World War, Holocaust, Germany, Israel, and we saw like there are massive cultural wounds when millions of people have been traumatized approximately at the same time. And that creates kind of a societal function. And so we call this historic trauma. There's a societal response to, I don't know, a city being bombed or a country being bombed. And and then the last part is that it also didn't start with those wars. So then through the groups and the work, I discovered more and more, wow, we are actually living in a world that holds hundreds of thousands of years of trauma. And since we have been born into that collective trauma field, we don't recognize that as trauma. So there are societal structures that are frozen and ice and trauma that we call that's how life is. And I think that's maybe what we want to also explore together.
Yeah, I'm really glad that that's where we're sort of building the foundation for the conversation because it seems like there's a vast difference and yet they're exactly the same. The difference between the two and how they play out, that one is a macrocosm with these global events, but then there's also the microcosm of how those huge events filter down into individuals, how this big event specifically impacted people, like for example the Holocaust affected the entire world, and now this is the way the world is, as you were saying. But there's also people who are the ancestors of someone who experienced one of the concentration camps, where it's big picture, small picture.
Exactly, exactly. And so like the that we are living in and through those layers of an onion, and that it's very easy to mix those, like that there is personal trauma work needed, there's ancestral trauma work needed, and there is, I believe, through large groups, a kind of a we space trauma work needed, where we work on the like collective dimension of the collective unconscious and the collective trauma architecture of countries, how societies are being built based on emergence, based on relation, based on healthy structures that are adaptable in life. So we create structures and we can deconstruct them and reconstruct them if evolution needs them. But the societal structures that are based on trauma, they don't want to change. And I think we see this very much now when we look at climate change, for example, or structural racism in the US. We see how those frozen structures, they don't want to change, and I think that's very painful. And sometimes we use the wrong way to approach them in order to change them, and then we get even more resistance back. So I think for that it's really very important to not only learn to see individual trauma symptoms of a person, but to learn to read the collective trauma systems of a country or a nation or a world.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the racism thing that's going on in the States now. I mean, this has always been an issue for many, many years, but now it's really becoming a big picture. Um, so I would love to address that. How does an entire country address the fact that a huge portion of its citizens have been deeply affected by something that another huge portion refuses to look at? How do you come together with something like that?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. We are sometimes saying a huge portion has been affected and another portion refuses, but the trauma in the perpetration is a deep effect of the refusal, and it's a lack of willingness to turn around and look at the pain that has been inflicted. So that's very important. How that fracture creates a societal turning away, and that turning away happens in our bodies, happens in our emotions, in our minds, in our societal structures. So that I think the first thing is that as a nation we get a feeling, and also that leaders of a nation, which I think starts to happen right now in the US also, that there is a new turning towards, and we have to, at least the people that are willing to turn towards and also be willing what it means to feel, because we turned away to not feel, and then we try to bridge that through knowing. And so when we turn back and we come back into a different relation, we will start to feel all the pain that has been inflicted and we have inflicted. And that's a difficult phase in a restoration process. And so if enough people are willing to do that restoration process, not just academically or mentally, but really holistically, then we can build new relations that will melt the structural racism and the structural violence and all the structures that are kind of stuck, and they are frozen unwillingness to meet, but mainly it's first to meet ourselves. And to because to turn towards means that we have to go through a deep transformation process and through a reparation process. And I think that's very challenging because many people know unconsciously that the structures of the society cannot stay the same as they are now. And so the restoration process that needs a reparation process is for many people a scary process, and that's why there is this avoidance. But I believe more and more people are willing, and I meet so many people that say, yes, exactly, we have to turn towards a collective trauma restoration. And I mean, we had so many people, at our summit, and there are so many people that really are willing to look at these topics in themselves deeper and also in society. So I'm very hopeful that there is a movement that together we can create structures, and those structures need to happen on multiple levels. They need to happen in groups that engage in that integration work deeply, but they need to happen through all the big pillars of a society: the justice system, the education system, the medical system, the governance and the government. Like there are many, many pillars of the society where that need to become more trauma informed, more collectively trauma informed, and then see how together, how we can do this together, like a restoration process for a nation. I think this is a very exciting work and prospect, and I think we are ready. I think we are on the verge to do that together.